Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Come in, come in. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders the way you like it, and let your head sink all the way down into the pillow. There is nothing you need to do now. Nothing to remember, nothing to solve. Nowhere else in the whole world you have to be. The lamp is low, the house is quiet, and I am going to sit here in this old chair, the way I always do, and tell you a story slowly, so slowly that you may not even reach the end of it before you drift off. That is all right. That is how it is supposed to go. Take a slow, deep breath for me. In and let it go, long and easy. Wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is on your side of the dark, let yourself settle in. Feel free, if you like, to leave a little note down below and tell me where you are listening from and what hour it is where you are. I do like to imagine all of you scattered out across the night. Some of you where it is raining, some of you where it is snowing, all of us gathered here for a little while in the same warm room. Tonight I want to tell you about two men, and about a mistake that almost everybody makes when they tell this story. It is a gentle mistake, the kind that gets repeated so many times that it hardens into a fact, the way a footpath gets worn into a hillside just because everyone before you walked the same way. And I want to walk you off that path, very kindly, and show you the truer road just beside it, the one that fewer people know. The story is about a writer. His name was Hermann Hesse. He was born in the year 1877, and he lived a long life, all the way to 1962, and along the way he wrote books that ended up in the hands of millions of people. In the year 1946, he was given the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is about the highest honor a writer can receive in this world, a kind of golden seal placed on a whole life's work. So that is where he ended up. High on the mountain, you might say, with the prize in his hands and his name known all over the earth. But that is the end of the road, and tonight we are not starting there. Tonight we are going all the way back down into the valley, into the darkest year this man ever lived, the year everything in his life seemed to come apart at once. Because hidden inside that shining prize, folded up small and quiet inside all that fame, is a secret, a real one. And it begins not on a mountaintop, but in a small country, in the middle of a terrible war, with a man who could not sleep. The year was 1916. Now, to understand how heavy that year was, you have to understand that troubles rarely come one at a time. You know this yourself. You have lived long enough to know that life does not hand you your sorrows politely, one and then another, with a rest in between. No, sometimes they all arrive together, crowding through the door at once, and you stand there in the middle of them not knowing which one to tend to first. That is what happened to Hermann Hesse in 1916. 4 great weights came down on him, nearly all at the same time. The first was his father. His father's name was Johannes Hesse, and in the March of that year he died. Now, losing a father is one of those sorrows that every one of us either has carried or one day will. It does not matter how old you are when it happens. It does not matter how ready you thought you were. When your father dies, some door at the back of your life quietly closes, and the room feels different afterward, colder somehow, even if you cannot say exactly why. Hermann felt that door close in the March of 1916, and that was only the first weight. The second weight was his child. Hesse had a young son, his youngest boy, and the boy's name was Martin. And that year little Martin fell seriously ill. I do not need to tell you, if you have ever loved a child, what it does to a parent to watch a small one suffer and not be able to simply lift the sickness away with your own two hands. It is a particular kind of helplessness, sharp and endless. You would trade places in a heartbeat if only the world let you, and the world never lets you. So there was Hermann, grieving his father with one hand and reaching toward his sick child with the other, already stretched thin between the two. And then came the third weight, and this one, I think, was the heaviest of all, because it was slow, and because there was no cure for it that anyone in that time knew how to give. It was his wife. Her name was Maria Bernoulli, though everyone who loved her called her Mia. Mia had been his companion for years. And in that same terrible stretch of time, Mia began to slip away from herself. Her mind began to come apart in a way that the doctors of the day would name schizophrenia. Now, I want to be gentle here, and I want to be clear, because it is a hard thing to speak of. Schizophrenia is an illness of the mind in which a person begins, little by little, to lose their grip on the shared world the rest of us are standing in. The walls between what is inside the head and what is outside it grow thin. Things that are not there begin to seem real. The person you knew, the person whose face you have looked at across the breakfast table 1,000 times, begins to become a stranger, present in the body but drifting somewhere you cannot follow. Imagine watching someone you love standing on the far bank of a river, and the river is slowly, silently widening, and no matter how you call to them, the water keeps coming up between you. That is something of what it is to watch a beloved person descend into that illness. And Hermann Hesse was watching it happen to his wife, in his own home, in the same months he was burying his father and nursing his son. 3 weights, then, and you might think that would be more than enough for any one man to carry. But there was a 4th, and it came not from inside his home, but from the whole wide world outside it, and it was pressing in on the windows. Because all of this was happening during a war. A great and terrible war was tearing across Europe in those years, and Hermann Hesse hated it. He was a man of peace by his very nature. He could not stomach the killing, and he could not stomach the roaring, flag-waving fervour that seemed to have swept up so many of his countrymen, the way a strong wind will sweep up dry leaves and send them all rushing in the same direction. He had written, back at the very start of it all, in the year 1914, a short piece begging his fellow writers and thinkers to keep their heads, to hold on to their common humanity, not to lose themselves in the hatred of the hour. He gave that piece a title borrowed from an old song, a phrase that means, roughly, "Oh friends, not these tones," a plea, if you like, to stop striking that harsh, ugly note and to find a kinder music. "Oh friends," he was saying, "not this, not this," and for that plea they turned on him. I want you to sit with that for a moment, gently, because it is one of the loneliest things that can happen to a person. He had asked, softly and reasonably, for peace. And in return, the loud voices of the nationalist newspapers in his old homeland fell upon him and called him a traitor. A traitor, to be branded like that, publicly, in print, for the whole country to read, while you are already drowning in private grief at home. To have your own people, the people you came from, decide that your gentleness is a kind of treason. He was not even doing anything warlike. Quite the opposite. He was living in Switzerland, in the city of Bern, quietly organizing books and aid to be sent to German prisoners of war, men locked up far from home, so that they might have something to read, some small human comfort in their captivity. That was his crime. Kindness to prisoners and a horror of killing. and for it they called him a traitor in the papers. So there he was, grieving father, sick son, a wife whose mind was leaving her, and a nation shouting that he was a traitor. Four weights, all at once, all pressing down. And the body, keeps the score of all of this. It always does. You cannot carry that much sorrow in the mind without the body coming to collect its share. Hermann began to suffer terrible headaches, the kind that wrap around the skull like an iron band and will not let go, and he could not sleep. Night after night, the sleep would not come. He would lie there in the dark, the way perhaps some of you are lying now, but with none of this ease, none of this rest, lying there with his mind roaring like the sea, going over and over the father and the son and the wife and the newspapers, unable to shut any of it off, watching the black window slowly turn grey with a dawn that brought him no relief. He called it, in the plain and honest words of his own time, a nervous collapse, a breakdown. The whole structure of the man, the thing that had been holding him upright and holding him together, simply gave way under the weight, the way a shelf will finally crack and come down when you have piled just one book too many upon it. Now here is the thing about a breakdown, and it is a strange mercy hidden inside a hard fact. A breakdown is, sometimes, the only door left. When a man is standing strong and everything is fine, he does not often go looking down into the deep and difficult places of himself. Why would he? Everything is fine. But when everything comes apart, when he can no longer sleep and can no longer pretend and can no longer hold the pieces together with his ordinary daytime strength, then, and often only then, he finally becomes willing to go somewhere new, to ask for help, to sit down in front of another human being and say, honestly, I cannot do this alone anymore. And that is exactly what Hermann Hesse did in the May of 1916. He went for help. Now this is the place in the story where almost everyone, for 100 years now, has taken the worn footpath. Because if you ask most people who know a little about Hermann Hesse, who helped him in his darkest hour, who it was that sat across from him and helped him put his broken pieces back together, and, in doing so, quietly changed the books he would go on to write. They will give you one name, and they will give it to you with great confidence. They will say, Carl Jung. You may have heard that name yourself, Carl Gustav Jung. He was one of the most famous doctors of the mind who ever lived, a Swiss psychiatrist, the founder of a whole way of understanding the human soul that came to be called analytical psychology. A towering figure, a giant. And so the story that has come down to us, smooth and simple and repeated 10,000 times, is this: the great Carl Jung took the broken novelist Hermann Hesse onto his couch, analysed him, healed him, and poured his own grand ideas into him, and Hesse then went off and wrote those ideas up as novels. The doctor cured the writer, and the writer became the doctor's pupil, his mouthpiece, his illustrator. That is the path everyone walks, neat, tidy, easy to remember. And it is not quite true. Let me pour you a little more of that tea, and let me tell you what really happened, because the truth is stranger, and I think far more beautiful than the tidy version, and it turns on a name that almost nobody remembers. Because the man Hermann Hesse actually went to see in the May of 1916 was not Carl Jung. Take a slow breath with me here. Let your shoulders drop down away from your ears. Notice how the room has grown a little softer, a little dimmer as I have been talking. Good, just rest there. The man Hesse went to see was a doctor named Josef Bernhard Lang. Lang, a name you have very likely never heard in your life, and there is a reason for that, which we will come to. Josef Lang was born in the year 1881, which made him a few years younger than Hesse himself. He was a physician, a doctor, yes, but more than that, and this is the important part. He was a disciple of Carl Jung. A disciple, a follower. One of the men who had gathered around Jung and learned his new way of listening to the human soul and had taken it up as his own. So Jung was there in the room, in a sense, but only at one remove. Jung was the master, Lang was the student who had gone out to do the work. Think of it the way you might think of a great old craftsman who has trained an apprentice. When you bring your broken chair to the workshop to be mended, it is very often not the famous old master himself who takes it in hand. It is the apprentice working in the master's method, in the master's spirit, but with his own two hands. Hermann Hesse's broken chair, his broken self, was taken in hand by the apprentice, by Josef Lang. And where did this happen? It happened in a place with a lovely, gentle name. A sanatorium, that is an old word for a kind of quiet resting place, a house set apart, usually somewhere calm and green, where people went to recover from illnesses of the body or the mind, away from the noise and rush of ordinary life. This one was called Kurhaus Sonnmatt, and it stood near the city of Lucerne, in the beautiful heart of Switzerland, in a country of blue lakes and white mountains. Imagine a large, calm house, with wide windows looking out on the green, where the days were slow and the world's roar was kept at a distance. That is where Hermann Hesse came, in the May of that terrible year, to sit down with Dr. Josef Lang and begin, at last, to look honestly into the storm inside himself. And they did not do this once or twice. This is the second thing the tidy version gets wrong. This was not some brief little visit, a quick word with the great man and off you go, cured, no. Hermann Hesse and Josef Lang sat together, session after session, over and over, for month after month. The number that usually gets passed down is around 72 sessions. Now, I will be honest with you the way a grandfather ought to be honest, because I would not want to tell you something as a hard fact when it is really more of a good guess. Different people who have counted have come up with slightly different numbers, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 60, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 72. The exact tally is a little uncertain, the way these old records often are. But the shape of it is clear enough, and the shape is what matters. Something like 70 conversations, stretching across a year and a half, all the way into the late part of 1917. 70 times this grieving, sleepless, slandered man travelled to sit in a quiet room and speak the truth of himself to Josef Lang and be heard. 70 times. Think of what that means. Think of how a single honest conversation with the right person, when you are drowning, can feel like a hand pulling you up toward the air. And then imagine 70 of them, laid end to end over 18 months. That is not a quick cure. That is not a magic word from a famous doctor. That is slow, patient, difficult work, week after week, the way a river does not carve a canyon in an afternoon, but only over long, long stretches of unhurried time. Drop after drop, session after session. The man who did that patient carving with Hermann Hesse was not the famous Carl Jung. It was the almost forgotten Josef Lang. So now perhaps you are beginning to feel the little question opening up in you, the same question that ought to open up in anyone who hears this. If it was not Jung, if the real work, the 70 sessions, The year and a half in the quiet house near Lucerne was done by this other man. Then who on earth was Josef Lang? Who was this apprentice that history so nearly lost? What sort of a man was he that a writer as strange and searching as Hermann Hesse would open his whole broken soul to him again and again for a year and a half? And here is where the story gets truly interesting, because Josef Lang was no ordinary doctor. If you are picturing a stiff man in a white coat with a clipboard, someone who asks you dull questions and writes down dull answers, then let go of that picture entirely. Josef Lang was nothing like that. Josef Lang was, by all accounts, a wonderfully strange man. An eccentric, people called him, which is a kind word we use for a person who simply does not fit the ordinary mould, who has gone off and grown in his own peculiar direction like a tree that leans out over a cliff, instead of standing up straight in the field with all the others. Lang's mind was full of old and unusual things. He was steeped, soaked through, the way a cloth is soaked in dye until the colour is part of the very threads, in ancient mysteries. He was fascinated by something called Gnosticism, which is a very old, half-hidden way of thinking about God and the soul that reaches back to the earliest centuries after the ancient world. A tradition full of secret knowledge and strange gods, and the idea that deep within a person there is a hidden spark of the divine that has half forgotten where it came from. He knew ancient languages, the kind most people never learn, the tongues in which those old secret books were written. He studied the stars, the old art of reading meaning in the heavens. He loved mysticism, that whole realm of experience where a person feels themselves touching something vast and holy that lies just beyond the edge of the everyday world. This was the furniture of Josef Lang's mind. Not the tidy furniture of the ordinary clinic, but something older, darker, richer, lit by candlelight rather than by the bright electric bulb. Now, you might wonder whether that was a good thing in a doctor. And I will tell you honestly, it made him a very unusual sort of healer. He was not really the kind of man who wanted to file your soul down until it fit neatly into the ordinary world. He was more the kind of man who wanted to go with you down into the deep places and see what was actually there, the treasures and the monsters both. And for a patient like Hermann Hesse, who was, after all, an artist, a man whose whole life was about looking into the deep places and coming back with something to show for it, that turned out to be exactly the right kind of guide. A tidy, ordinary doctor might have tried simply to calm Hesse down, to smooth him over, to send him back out into the world adjusted and quiet and dull. Josef Lang did something else. Josef Lang went exploring with him. And so the two of them, the wounded writer and the strange mystical doctor, sat together in that quiet house near Lucerne, and something happened between them that went far beyond the ordinary business of a patient and his physician. Because over time, and this is one of the tenderest turns in the whole story, Josef Lang stopped being merely Hesse's doctor at all. He became his friend, his true friend, a lifelong one. Not a doctor you see for your treatment and then leave behind when you are well, but a companion of the mind, a man you keep close for the rest of your days, someone you can argue with and wonder with and lean on. They became, you might say, two travellers who had met on the same difficult road and decided to keep walking it together. And here is something even stranger and even more human, and I want you to hold it gently because there is a whole world of feeling folded up inside it. As the years went on, the roles between these two men began, quietly, to turn around. In the beginning it was clear enough. Hesse was the broken one, the patient, the one who came for help, and Lang was the healer, the strong one, the one who gave it. But life is not so simple, and the people who help us are not made of stone. They have their own storms. And Josef Lang, this deep and unusual man, had his own troubles, his own darknesses that would come for him in time. And so, as the years passed, there came seasons in which it was the once broken writer, Hermann Hesse, who became the steadier of the two, and the troubled doctor who leaned on him. The healer came to need healing. The one who had pulled the drowning man out of the water found, later, that he himself was slipping under, and it was the man he had once saved who reached back to him. There is something almost unbearably true about that, isn't there? That the people who mend us are so often just as broken as we are, mending us out of a wisdom they earned from their own wounds, not from any perfect wholeness. That healing does not flow one way, from the strong to the weak, like water pouring downhill, but back and forth between two people over a lifetime. First one holding the other up, then the other holding the first. Hermann Hesse and Josef Lang were held together like that, each in his turn the strong one, each in his turn the one who needed help for the rest of their lives. So you see already, do you not, how the tidy little footpath Jung cured Hesse misses almost everything that matters. It was not Jung. It was Lang. It was not a quick famous cure. It was 70 patient conversations across a year and a half. And it was not a doctor filing his patient down to fit the world. It was two searching, wounded men becoming friends for life and taking turns holding each other up. That is the truer road. That is where we are walking tonight. And I have not even told you yet what all of this did to the books. Because that is the real secret, the thing hidden inside the Nobel Prize we started with. That golden honour sitting at the far end of Hermann Hesse's life, inside it, folded up small, is this. Is 1916. Is the dead father and the sick son, and the wife whose mind was leaving, and the newspapers crying traitor? Is the sleepless nights, and the iron headaches and the breakdown? Is the quiet house near Lucerne, and the strange doctor full of ancient stars and hidden gods, and the 70 conversations? All of it went down into the writer like rain going down into the roots of a tree. And what came back up in the years that followed were books unlike anything he had written before. Books that people would still be reading and loving 100 years later. And in those books, if you know how to look, you can find the fingerprints of that quiet room. You can find the strange doctor himself, hidden in plain sight inside a character. You can find a secret god whose name appeared in the very same span of years in two entirely different places at once, and no one is quite sure to this day who whispered it first. But those are stories for a little further along, and I can hear that your breathing has already begun to slow and deepen, which is exactly as it should be. So let us not rush toward any of it. Let us just rest here for a moment, you and I, at the edge of 1916, with the great question hanging softly in the air between us, the way a single candle flame hangs steady in a still room. If it was not Jung who did the work, if it was this other man, this Josef Lang, this apprentice full of ancient mysteries, almost lost now to memory, then a whole hidden story has been sitting there all along, just beside the one everybody tells, waiting for someone to notice it. Take a slow, deep breath for me now. Feel the weight of your own body sinking down into the bed, heavy and safe and warm. Notice how quiet it has become, both in the room and perhaps a little inside you. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The father, the son, the wife, the newspapers, none of it is yours to carry. You are only here to listen and to rest and to let the story move over you the way a slow river moves over smooth stones. And when you are ready, we will go on together, down into the year that followed the darkness, and into the book that came pouring out of it, and into the secret hidden in the name on its cover. For now, just breathe. Just rest. Just let yourself sink a little deeper into the warm dark, while the old question keeps its patient watch beside us in the lamplight, and the tea grows cool, and the house holds still all around us. If not Jung, then who? We have found the beginning of the answer tonight, in a quiet man named Josef Lang. And there is so much more of him, and of the writer he mended, still waiting just ahead. So then, September of 1917. The sessions with Josef Lang have been running for close to a year and a half by now, those long, slow afternoons at Kurhaus Sonnmatt, with the smell of pine and the sound of the mountains holding the building on all sides. Hermann Hesse has been sitting across from this strange, learned, slightly unworldly man, and something has been loosening inside him. Not cured, not mended in the way a broken clock is mended, so that it runs again as if nothing happened. Something else, something more like a room that has been shut for years finally opened, not to let in light necessarily, but simply to let the stale air out. And then, in September of 1917, something happens that even the biographers find a little astonishing. Hesse writes a book. Not slowly, not with the usual stops and starts and long walks and anguished revisions. He writes it in a burst, the way water comes through a dam that has finally given way. September into October, roughly 6 weeks, and there it is, a whole novel, coherent and strange, and lit from within by something he has never quite done before. He calls it Demian. Let us sit with that for a moment. 6 weeks. After the year he has just had, after the father's death in March of 1916, after the long sessions with Lang, after the headaches and the sleeplessness and the slow unravelling he had described, when it was at its worst, as a nervous collapse, after all of that, 6 weeks and a finished novel. There is a word for when creation comes that fast, that fully formed. The word is not discipline, and it is not craft, though both are present. The word is pressure. The word is release. Something had been building in him, pooling in the dark behind the dam, and the months with Lang had not so much created it as cleared the channel for it. The novel is about a boy named Emil Sinclair. Sinclair lives in 2 worlds from the beginning. The bright, orderly world of his parents' house, with its prayers and its clean tablecloths and its assumption that goodness is simply a matter of following the rules, and another world, darker and more alive, that he can feel just beyond the edge of the lamplight, but cannot name. A bully named Franz Kromer finds him there, in the gap between the 2 worlds, and wraps a secret around him like a chain. And then, from somewhere deeper still, a strange older boy named Max Demian steps in and simply looks at Kromer, and Kromer goes away. Just like that. As if the shadow had found its own shadow, and the 2 cancelled each other out. This is the shape of the book. Not a plot so much as a series of encounters, each one pushing Emil Sinclair a little further from the bright known world, and a little deeper into himself. The encounters get stranger as they go. A schoolmaster who turns out to know more about Gnosticism than about Scripture. A drunken organist who plays Bach in the dark and talks about gods nobody else remembers. a woman named Frau Eva, who seems less like a character in a novel and more like a presence, a principle, a kind of living archetype. The bully Franz Kromer, the shadow that must be named before it can release you. Demian scholars have written whole essays about Kromer, and if you have ever had a secret you were ashamed of, a small lie that grew, a wrong thing you did that someone else found out, a hook they slid into you and you let them because you were afraid, then you already know what Kromer is. He is not just a character, he is the mechanism by which the unacknowledged part of yourself gains power over you. He is what happens when the shadow goes unnamed. Lang must have understood that. It is not hard to imagine why those afternoon sessions in Sonnmatt might have begun, even gently, to loosen the grip of the Kramers in Hesse's own life, the internal ones, the long-carried shames, the places where he had been dishonest with himself, and then found, to his surprise, that the dishonesty had given someone or something else a hold on him. But let us come now to the organist, because the organist is where the story becomes something more than personal. His name in the novel is Pistorius. He plays the organ in an old stone church, alone in the evenings, and he finds Emil Sinclair one night listening outside in the cold, drawn to the sound. What follows is a friendship unlike any other in the book. Pistorius is not interested in Emil Sinclair's grades, or his prospects, or his reputation, or his soul in the conventional religious sense. He is interested in Emil Sinclair's gods, the real ones, the ones the boy does not yet know he has. He teaches Sinclair about Abraxas. He teaches him that the gods of the surface world, the respectable, sanctioned, domesticated gods, are not all the gods there are. That somewhere beneath the clean narrative of good and evil there is a deeper power that contains both, that is neither and both, that does not divide the world into the permitted and the forbidden, but holds all of it as one living thing. And he does this the way a man teaches who has himself been changed by what he teaches, with a kind of urgency that is also calm, an excitement that has been lived with so long it has gone quiet and deep. Now here is the thing that makes Pistorius more than a character in a novel. He is a real man. The organist heretic of Demian, this Gnostic-minded musician who teaches a young man to listen to the gods his parents never mentioned, he is in all the ways that matter Josef Bernhard Lang, the analyst sitting across from Hesse in the Sonnmatt sanatorium. Hesse's own doctor, his own companion through the darkness of 1916. This identification is not a guess. It is not the kind of thing a literary scholar reaches for because they want the story to be tidy. Hesse himself acknowledged it in the oblique and careful way that a man acknowledges having put someone he loves into a book, not quite a confession, but not a denial either. And when you read the passages about Pistorius knowing about Gnosticism, about astrology, about ancient languages, about the mystical underground that runs beneath official religion, when you understand that Lang was genuinely all of these things, that he was less a conventional clinician than a man soaked in exactly this kind of arcane learning, the identification holds. It holds the way a key holds in a lock, precisely, without forcing. And there is a sadness in it that Hesse does not flinch from. Because Pistorius in the novel is a man Emil Sinclair eventually outgrows. Not cruelly, not with contempt. But Sinclair moves past him. He reaches a place the teacher cannot follow, and he names it, kindly, but directly, and Pistorius receives the judgment with a kind of dignity that has loss in it. He is, Sinclair says, a man who could teach others the roads, but could not walk them himself. A guide to a country he would never live in. And this, too, the biographer's note, carries the weight of something observed. Lang, in the years that followed his work with Hesse, struggled. The relationship between them shifted over time, the roles gently reversing, the patient becoming more stable as the doctor grew more unmoored. The healer needing healing. We will come back to that a little further on when the time for it arrives. For now, just notice what Hesse did. He put his doctor in his novel, gave him a pipe organ and a cold stone church, and a mouth full of forgotten gods, made him beautiful and wise, and finally unable to cross the threshold he had opened. He honoured him and exceeded him in the same breath. This is what novelists do. It is possibly the most loving thing they know how to do. Now let us come to the strange, still centre of the book. The passage is short. It lives in a letter that Max Demian sends to Emil Sinclair, and it has been quoted so often that its strangeness has perhaps been worn smooth, the way a stone gets smooth from too many hands. But let us read it again slowly, together, with the patience of people who have nowhere else to be. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Whoever wants to be born must destroy a world. The bird flies to God. The God's name is Abraxas. Rest there for a second. Just let it sit. The bird fighting its way out of the egg. Not hatching. Fighting. Because the shell is a whole world, a whole way of understanding everything. And it does not give way easily. And it should not. Because if it gave way easily, it would mean the shell was not a real world, and the bird breaking free of it would not be a real birth. The egg is the world, not a specific world, not the world of childhood, not the world of convention, not the world of bourgeois Wilhelmine Germany, though it is all of those things too in the novel. The egg is whatever complete, closed, self-consistent reality a person has been living inside, believing it to be the only reality there is. To become more than you are, the book is saying, you have to break what has been containing you. Not in anger, not in rebellion for its own sake. Because the bird has grown too large for the shell, and the bird flies to God. But the God's name is Abraxas. This is where the passage tilts into something you might not expect, and where Hesse crosses into territory that is century, with its tidy division of things into good and evil, found and still finds, genuinely difficult. Abraxas is a real word, an old word. It comes from the Gnostic traditions of the early centuries, the complex, often persecuted spiritual movements that ran alongside early Christianity and refused its simplifications. In those traditions, Abraxas was sometimes understood as a power that contained all opposites, light and dark, creation and destruction, the sacred and what conventional religion called the profane. Not a god of goodness in the ordinary sense, not a god of evil, a god who held both, without resolving them, without pretending the resolution had happened. This made Abraxas uncomfortable for Orthodox religion, and Orthodoxy dealt with him the way it often deals with uncomfortable things. It forgot him. It tucked him away in obscure texts that almost no one read. It let him become a curiosity, a footnote, a word on a dusty page, in a library where the librarians knew which shelves to steer the students away from. And then, in the year 1916, the same year Hesse was sitting with Lang in the Sonnmatt sanatorium, Abraxas resurfaced. He resurfaced twice. The first time was in Demian, in that brief burning passage about the bird and the egg and the god, whose name should not need to be hidden from anyone, but somehow always is. The second time was in a small document that Carl Gustav Jung composed in 1916, the same year, in Snacht-on-the-Lake. Jung called it Septem Sermones ad Mortuos. 7 sermons to the dead, He did not publish it in the usual sense of publishing. He had it privately printed and distributed to a small circle of people he trusted. It was unusual even by his standards, written, he said in a burst, over 3 evenings, in a state he could only describe as dictation, as if the text came through him rather than from him. Strange as this sounds, it is what he reported. And in those 7 sermons, Abraxas appears, not as a footnote, as a central figure, as the power that stands above both the God of goodness and the God of evil, containing both, resolving neither, vast and unspeakable, and more fundamental than either of the familiar poles. Both men, the same year, the same rare word for the same buried, nearly forgotten idea. Now, here is the question I want to stay with for a moment, because it is a genuinely interesting question and it deserves the patience of a slow night. Who came first? Did Hesse read Jung's 7 sermons before he wrote Demian? Was there a copy floating through the small circles of Zurich and Küsnacht and the surrounding intellectual world, passed from hand to hand in the way that unusual documents passed, before the age of instant dissemination? Did Lang, who was close to Jung, who was his disciple, who carried Jung's ideas in his bones, did Lang bring the word to Hesse, perhaps without even naming the source? Or did Jung read an early draft of Demian, or hear of its contents from someone in Hesse's circle, and weave the same word into his sermons in a resonance that ran the other direction? Or, and this is the possibility I find most interesting, most honest, most resistant to the tidy explanation, did neither of them borrow it from the other? Did 2 men circling the same underground question about what lies beneath the surface of the self reach down independently into the same stratum of forgotten symbols and pull up the same dusty, half-remembered name? We do not know. The biographers who have looked at this carefully, Ralph Friedman among them, in his thorough account of Hesse's life, flag the connection but do not resolve it. The direction of influence is, to use a phrase that careful historians use when they mean what they say, genuinely uncertain. The chronology could support more than one reading. The circles overlapped in ways that are hard to trace precisely, and the archival record is not complete enough to settle the question, and I think we should let it stay unsettled. Not because precision does not matter, but because the unsettled question is truer to what actually happened. 2 seekers, digging in the same direction, 2 men who had both entered their own darknesses in the same stretch of years, both feeling their way towards something that had no clean modern name, and both arriving at a word that old Gnostic thinkers had coined for the thing that is too large to be only good and too present to be only evil. Whatever flowed between them in the way of direct influence, something stranger and perhaps more significant was also happening, a kind of underground convergence, the way 2 rivers following the same gradient of land will sometimes meet in the same valley without either one choosing it. Abraxas, say it slowly if you like. The sound of it is odd in the mouth, not quite Greek, not quite anything familiar. The Gnostics used it. Late antique magicians scratched it on amulets. Medieval alchemists whispered it in their workrooms. And in 1916, 2 men, one a Swiss psychiatrist in the middle of a crisis of his own, one a German-Swiss novelist in the middle of the worst year of his life, each reached for it independently, or together, or in some combination of both, and used it to name the thing that will not fit inside the ordinary categories. This is the Abraxas fingerprint, and it matters not because it proves that Hesse copied Jung or Jung copied Hesse. It matters because it shows that they were genuinely inhabiting the same question from different directions, and that the question was real. Now, let us come back to the novel and its cover. Demian was finished by late 1917. Hesse held it for a while. He did not publish it under his own name. He published it in 1919 under the name Emil Sinclair. Sinclair, you will notice, is also the name of the narrator, the boy whose story the novel tells. So the author signed himself with his own character's name, the created person lending his name back to his creator, the way a dream figure might, in the morning, leave something of itself in the waking person who dreamed him. Why did Hesse do this? There are several reasons, and they are not all the same reason. He was, in 1917 and into 1918, still publicly marked as a traitor by a portion of the German press, the man who had written O Freunde, nicht desertni, the anti-war essay of 1914, and who had refused to take back the words as the war ground on and German nationalism demanded a different answer from its intellectuals. He was working in Bern, helping organize books and material support for German prisoners of war, which some saw as aid and others saw as consorting with the enemy. He had reason to know that a novel published under his name would be read through the lens of that controversy, would be praised or damned not on its own terms, but as a weapon in a political argument. But there was something else too. Something that had more to do with the book itself. Demian was not quite like his earlier work. His previous novels, Peter Kamenzind, Beneath the Wheel, Gertrude, were recognizable products of an established, respected writer. They were the work of a man the literary world had a comfortable sense of. Demian was different. It came from somewhere that his earlier work had not been. It was stranger, more interior, more charged with a kind of symbolic voltage that he had not carried in quite that way before. If you were to read it, not knowing who wrote it, you might not immediately say, yes, the same man who wrote those earlier novels. You might say, this is a young writer, raw and urgent, still unformed but lit from within. And so perhaps there was also in the pseudonym a genuine instinct that the book required it, that it needed to come into the world as if newly born, without the accumulated weight of Hermann Hesse and his reputation and his controversies and his known qualities. Emil Sinclair needed to arrive as a stranger, not as the next publication from an established name. He arrived, and the literary world of 1919 received him well. Demian was awarded the Fontane Prize. This was a prize given to promising new authors, writers at the beginning of their careers, who had shown unusual talent in a first or early work. The committee who gave it were, apparently, moved by the novel, by its strangeness and its conviction, by the sense that here was a genuinely new voice arriving in German letters. And then someone looked more closely at Emil Sinclair. When Hesse's identity was uncovered, and it was, fairly quickly, in the way that literary secrets of this kind tend to be, the style too particular, the sensibility too recognizable to those who knew his work, he was in a difficult position. He had won a prize meant for new writers. He was not a new writer. He was a celebrated novelist who had published under a false name. He returned the prize. There is something in that gesture that I find quietly moving. Not that he was forced to, not that the committee demanded it, or that there was any legal compulsion. He simply saw the situation clearly and made the only choice that was consistent with the person he was trying to become, which was a person with fewer of the disguises and not more of them. He had published the book behind a false face because something in him needed to. When the false face was removed, he did not argue for the right to keep it. He gave the prize back and put his own name on the book and let it stand there, revealed as his. The book that came pouring out of the darkest 18 months of his life. The book written in 6 weeks after nearly 18 months of slow, strange, painful conversations with a Gnostic-minded organist's double in a sanatorium near Lucerne. The book that hid a pseudonym the way certain birds hide their nests, not out of shame exactly, but out of a knowledge that the egg needs its quiet before it is ready to be found. The egg is the world. Whoever wants to be born must destroy a world. Hesse destroyed a world in the writing of that book. Not the external world. The external world was doing its own destroying, efficiently, in the trenches of France and Belgium and the Eastern Front. He destroyed an internal one. The self that had gone into the Sonnmatt sanatorium was not quite the self that came out of it, and Demian is the record of that passage, written in the white heat of the crossing, while the crossing was still happening, while the shell was still giving way and the bird was still fighting. And the strange organist, the failed prophet who could teach the roads but not walk them, who sat in the cold church and played Bach in the dark and talked about the God above God and below God, he is there in the book. Carrying his pipe and his old knowledge and his tenderness that somehow coexists with his being unable, in the end, to save himself. Lang gave Hesse something. This much is not in question. Exactly what it was is harder to name than it looks, because it was not information in the ordinary sense. Lang did not teach Hesse about Jung's concepts the way a professor teaches a student about a theory. Lang opened something. He sat with Hesse in the open space of those 70 or so hours, across a desk, in a room that smelled of the mountains, with enough silence between them for the silence to do its own work, and something that had been frozen began to thaw. And Hesse, being a novelist, did what novelists do with things that thaw inside them. He turned them into story, not explanation. Story, a boy named Emil Sinclair, a bully named Franz Kromer, a shadow that must be named before you can be free of it, a strange friend named Max Demian, whose eyes see further than they should, an organist in a cold church, a mother figure named Frau Eva, who is less a woman than a kind of living principle of welcoming. All of it translated from the interior into the particular, from the feeling into the face. This is the thing that makes Demian not quite a Jungian allegory, even though it is saturated with Jungian waters. An allegory is a clean, controlled thing. It takes an idea and dresses it in a story costume, and if you undress the characters carefully, you find the idea still standing there, unchanged. Underneath, Demian is not quite that. The characters have a life that exceeds the ideas they carry. Emil Sinclair is not just the developing ego learning to integrate the shadow. He is a boy who is cold in a churchyard and frightened of a bully and aching for the sound of music in a dark building and desperately, hungrily trying to understand what the world is and what he is in it. The ideas swim in that water, but they did not make the water. And Abraxas swims there too. The bird in the egg, the God whose name is too big for either of the categories we have been given. Whatever Jung was writing in his private 3-evening composition in Znacht, in the same year that Hesse was sitting with Lang, in the same general territory of the world, discovering the same word for the same unnameable thing, whatever was happening in those parallel darknesses, in those two private confrontations with the same enormous question, it left a word in the air between them. A word that neither of them had invented. A word that had been waiting in the Gnostic underground for nearly 2,000 years, patient as a seed. The bird fights its way out of the egg. Let us just hold that image for a moment before we go further. Let it move through you quietly, not as a thing to interpret, but as a thing to feel. Because maybe you know something about this, about a world that felt like the only world, and that turned out to be a shell. About the moment when the shell began to crack, and how terrifying and necessary the cracking was. About the exhaustion of the fighting, and the air on the other side of it, strange and cold and enormous, nothing at all like what you thought was out there, and yet somehow exactly what was needed. That is the bird Hesse put in his novel. That is the egg. That is the god with the strange and ancient name at the end of the flight. And the man who helped him find the word for it was not a famous name. He was Josef Lang. He was a physician who knew about Gnosticism and astrology and ancient languages and the underground rivers that run beneath the official story of what human beings are. He was a man who played in real life something of the role that Pistorius plays in the novel. A teacher who opened a door and then found himself, later, standing on the wrong side of it. He was, to borrow the language Hesse's book uses for that figure, a man who knew the way without being able to walk it. He has been almost entirely forgotten by history. You will not find his name in casual conversations about the great works of German literature. You will not find it on the signs outside museums or in the titles of documentary films. He left no major body of work of his own. What he left, mostly, is the presence of Pistorius in one of the most significant novels of the 20th century. An echo, a silhouette in someone else's light. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is more than enough to have been present with enough quiet steadiness during the 18 months that broke a man open and let the book come through. To have been the strange organist in the cold church, the one who knew about Abraxas when no one else was naming him. To have been that, even without recognition. Even without the prize, even without the history books remembering your name. There are forms of importance that leave no monument. They leave a book instead. Demian, published in 1919 under a borrowed name, won a prize for beginners by a man who was not a beginner, had to be given back when the real author was found, and then stood, and still stands, with Hesse's name on it, as the first full record of what those terrible and transformative months produced. The bird is out of the egg now, and the story is just beginning. Because the book is done, but the relationship with depth psychology is not. The questions that Lang opened are still open. Hesse has not become a disciple. He has not signed on to any theory or school or movement. He has taken what he needed the way a person takes shelter from a storm, gratefully, and without intending to live there permanently. And there is someone else now waiting at the edge of the story. Someone who wrote to Hesse about Demian around 1919 with what the record suggests was genuine appreciation. Someone whose force of personality Hesse would later describe in terms that suggest he was not easy to be unimpressed by. Carl Gustav Jung himself. The analysis with Lang was the long one, the real one, the 70 or so hours across those 18 months. But it was not the only encounter with the analytic world that Hesse would have. A shorter period of direct contact with Jung followed, a few years later, in 1921, near Knacht. A meeting of the minds that had been circling each other across the correspondence, in the same general country, sharing a word for a god that neither of them had invented. What happened there, and what Hesse did with it, and why he ultimately walked away from the orbit rather than settling into it. That is where we are going next. along with the strange suspended middle of Siddhartha, which stalled for more than a year in a way that some have read as bound up with precisely this renewed contact, along with the question of what it means for a novelist to use a psychology without becoming its prisoner. But first, for a moment, let us rest with what we have. The book exists. It was written in 6 weeks. It carries a hidden organist named Pistorius, who is a real man named Lang. It carries a god named Abraxas, who appeared, in the same year, in a privately printed document by a psychiatrist on a lake in Switzerland. It was published under a false name, won a prize it had to return, and then stood with the real name on it, as clear and strange and burning as the image it gave us. The bird has fought its way out, the egg is broken. The world that was inside it, the small, ordered, shame-governed world of the boy who was afraid of Franz Kromer, is gone. And somewhere insnucked, a psychiatrist has just read the book with what we can only imagine was a very particular kind of recognition. There is something that does not get said often enough about the years that followed. While Hesse was in the sanatorium near Lucerne, while he was walking through those long sessions with Josef Lang, while the sessions were slowly doing whatever it is that sessions do, he began to paint. Watercolours, mostly, small ones at first, a stretch of garden, a bowl of plums, a hillside in the afternoon light going amber at the edges. Nothing grand, nothing to hang in a gallery, just a man with a brush and water and colour, learning to look at a thing long enough to put it down on paper. He described it, later, as something close to therapy in itself. Not the sessions, not the talking, the painting, the act of sitting with a colour and asking it to tell you what it knew. And here is the thing that stops you, if you let it. At almost the same time, the same stretch of years, roughly 1913 to 1917, Carl Jung was also painting, drawing, filling the pages of what would eventually become his Red Book, his Liber Novus, with strange illuminated images from his own interior. Mandalas, figures from his dreams. A confrontation, as he would call it, with his own unconscious. A descent he undertook deliberately, alone, into the imagery that was rising in him, whether he wanted it or not. 2 men. Different houses, one a novelist, one a psychiatrist, both sitting with colour and image and the strange patient attention that painting asks of you. Both trying to survive their own inner life by giving it a shape they could look at from outside themselves. You can read that as coincidence. The early 20th century was full of people taking up painting, taking up inner work, taking up the vocabulary of the soul. Expressionism, surrealism, the whole restless European culture of the time was asking, what does the inside of a person look like when it is allowed to show itself? So it is not impossible that 2 men in Switzerland simply arrived at the same practice by different roads. But the coincidence has a texture to it. The same years, the same country, the same urgency. And they were already, by this point, in each other's orbit, not yet friends, not yet in the same room, but moving toward each other through the work of Lang, through the underground current of Gnostic imagery, through the shared word Abraxas that we have already followed. So the painting sits there, a small fact and a large resonance. 2 seekers, doing the same private work, in different chairs in different buildings, looking at what the inside of themselves had produced and trying to understand what to do with it. Let us stay with that image for a moment. It is a gentle one. A man at a table, near a window. Brush in hand, the garden outside, going slowly golden, the sanatorium quiet in the afternoon, the sessions behind him for the day, the voices and the memories and the images that were coming loose in the talking, all of it set down now, held still, translated into the small grammar of colour on paper. A tree. The same tree, again, a different angle of the same light. Something in him settling slightly, not fixed, not resolved. Just, held, witnessed, given a form it could rest in. That is what the painting was for. Not for beauty, for form. And somewhere else in Switzerland, a man with a red book was doing the same. Let us pause here for just a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice whatever has softened in you since we began tonight. The shoulders, maybe, the jaw. The place behind the eyes where the day tends to sit. When you are ready, we will continue. The letter came to Hesse sometime around 1919. It was from Jung. It was about Demian. The details of what Jung wrote are not catalogued in full, but what we know is this, he wrote appreciatively. He had read the book that came out under the false name Emil Sinclair, the book with the god Abraxas in it. The book Hesse had written in 6 weeks, in the white, hot autumn of 1917. Jung had read it, and he had written to say so, and the letter was warm. Think about what it would mean to receive that letter. Hesse had written the book under a false name, partly because he was not sure what it was. It did not feel like his other books. It felt like something that had come through him rather than from him, as though the analysis with Lang had opened a door and Demian had walked out of the room behind the door and stood there waiting to be written down. To have published it under his own name would have been, perhaps, too naked, too direct. Emil Sinclair was a useful distance between the man who sat in those sessions and the man who had to go on living in the world afterward. And now Jung, the man whose ideas had been circulating through those sessions, whose vocabulary Lang had carried into the consulting room with him, whose secretly printed Gnostic prose poem had contained the same word for the same forgotten god. Jung had read it and written to say that he recognized something in it. You do not have to speculate too hard about what that recognition felt like to receive. Something in Hesse had found its way to someone who could see it clearly enough to name it. That is a rare enough thing in a life. But then, and this is characteristic, this is so thoroughly Hesse that it could almost serve as a portrait of him, he did not rush toward the recognition. He did not write back to say, "Come in, come closer, be my guide." He waited. He held the distance. He kept the door half open, which is different from either opening it or closing it. This is important. We will come back to why. By 1919, Hesse had moved. The house in Bern, the house that had contained the marriage and the noise and the weight of those years, he had left it. He moved south, across the Alps, into the canton of Ticino in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, to a small village called Montagnola. A stone house, chestnut trees on the hillside, the light different down there, warmer, slower, more Mediterranean. The language around him, one he could let wash over him without having to carry its full weight. He was alone. The marriage to Mia Bernoulli was, by this point, effectively over, though the formal end would take time. He was in a new house, in a new kind of light, with the sessions behind him and Demian out in the world, and the question of what came next sitting with him in the mornings over coffee. He was writing. He was painting. He never stopped the painting. He would paint until very late in his life, and the watercolours would accumulate in the hundreds. He was thinking about what it meant to be a person who had gone through what he had gone through and come out somewhere he did not fully recognise yet. And in 1921 he went to see Jung. Not at a sanatorium this time. Not in the framework of a crisis. A shorter stretch of direct analysis, in or near Xnacht, where Jung had his house, by the lake, the house he was building almost literally with his own hands in those years, adding towers and rooms as his inner life required new chambers. Hesse went there, and they talked, and some of the talking was formally analytic, and some of it was probably something else. The kind of conversation two people have when they are both too large in their thinking to stay in assigned roles for very long. Hesse was impressed by Jung. He said so. The force of the man, the quality of attention, the way Jung could hold a contradictory thing with equal interest in both of its contradictions, not rushing to resolve them. This is a gift that is rarer than it sounds, and Hesse, who spent his whole life refusing to let his own contradictions be smoothed over, would have felt the recognition in it. But he did not stay. He did not become a Jungian. He did not return to Gnostic for more sessions after that shorter stretch was done. He came. He sat. He received something. And then he went back to Montagnola and the chestnut trees and the mornings at his desk and the watercolours in the afternoon. Some people find this puzzling. If the analysis with Lang had helped so much, and if this direct encounter with the source, the man whose entire framework had shaped those sessions, if that encounter was also valuable, then why pull back? Why not go further in? Hesse had an answer. He had actually put it in writing 3 years before that visit to Gnostic. In 1918, he published an essay. He called it Künstler und Psychoanalyse, Artists and Psychoanalysis. And in that essay he said, carefully and clearly, and with the specific authority of someone who had lived through what he was describing, that, for an artist, the analytic process carries a particular danger, not the danger most people might name. Not that it would expose some shameful thing, or that the analyst would misuse the intimacy of the confessional hour, or that the interpretation would be wrong. The danger he named was subtler than any of those. He said that analysis pursued for cure, pursued with the aim of arriving at normality, at adjustment, at a life that fits without chafing, could sterilize the very thing that made the artist. That the wound and the work were not separable. That the restlessness, the difficulty, the way an artist's interior never quite settled into the shape that ordinary life expected, these were not symptoms to be treated. They were the conditions of creation. Treat them away, and you might arrive at a calmer person who no longer needed to write. He did not say this as an argument against psychoanalysis. He was careful about that. He had found real help in what had happened at Kurhaus Sonnmatt. He was not the same person who had walked into that sanatorium in the spring of 1916, and he was grateful for what had shifted. But grateful was not the same as converted. The help was real. The danger was also real. Both things could be true at once. The goal, he wrote, was not adjustment to bourgeois normality. It was something harder and more honest, a deeper meeting with oneself, a more truthful account of what one actually was, with all its darkness and its contradictions and its refusal to be tidied away. That is a different project from cure. Cure imagines that the problem should be solved. This other thing imagines that the problem might be the center of the life, and that what you do with it, how you live alongside it, how you turn it, is the question. He had read Freud too. This is worth saying clearly because it is sometimes lost in the more romantic version of the story, where Jung appears as the single great influence and Freud is only a background figure to be reacted against. Hesse read the interpretation of dreams with genuine attention. He engaged with the Freudian vocabulary, the unconscious, the repression, the way the dream speaks in images what the waking mind cannot say directly. His absorption of depth psychology was not naive, and it was not sectarian. He was a working writer, which means he was always looking for what was useful, always willing to borrow from different traditions without pledging allegiance to any of them. What drew him more fully toward the Jungian approach than the Freudian one was probably not a theoretical preference, but a practical one. Freud's map pointed largely backward to the childhood, the family, the original wound, the scene that had laid down the pattern. Jung's map pointed in two directions at once, backward into the personal history, yes, but also forward into something he called the self, that larger wholeness that the individual is always, in some sense, trying to grow toward. For a novelist, for someone whose job is to imagine what a person might become, rather than simply to explain what a person has been, the forward direction mattered. And there was the mythology, the way Jung's thinking was soaked in image and symbol and the deep grammar of the human imagination. The gods, the fairy tales, the alchemical texts, the Gnostic fragments. Lang had carried all of that into those sessions at Sonnmatt, and it had spoken directly to the part of Hesse that had been writing fairy tales since before his crisis. The part that understood the world in stories rather than in arguments. So the influence was real. The use was real. The refusal was also real. He went to Knacht in 1921. He came back to Montagnola. He sat with what he had received. And then he began to finish a book. He had started it before the visit. He had been working on it, on and off, since he moved to Montagnola in 1919, sitting with it in the morning, putting it down, coming back to it, putting it down again. The first part had come fairly easily. The second part had not. The second part had stalled in a way that felt, to Hesse, like more than a technical problem. The book was Siddhartha. It came out in 1922. Now, you may know the name. You may have read it, years ago, in a certain kind of light, at a certain kind of moment in your life. It is one of those books that tends to arrive at the right time and stay. A short book, not many pages, set in ancient India, though Hesse never went to India and wrote it entirely from texts and imagination, and whatever it was in him that reached toward the east, as though the east were an interior compass direction. Its story, briefly, a young man named Siddhartha, a Brahmin's son, gifted, restless, leaves his home and his friend Govinda to seek liberation. He tries the ascetic path with the wandering Samanas. He encounters the Buddha himself, the awakened one, the Tathagata, and listens to his teaching. And then he does something extraordinary. He turns away from the Buddha, not with contempt, with profound respect and a precise, clear refusal. He says, in effect, your teaching is beautiful and true, and it cannot be transmitted. You found it yourself, through your life, and what you found cannot be handed to me through words. I must find my own way, through my own life. He goes into the world. He becomes a lover, a merchant, a success, a man of pleasures, and eventually a man of shadows, a man who has lost himself in exactly the way the teaching warned against. He hits bottom. He sits by a river and for a moment considers walking into it. And it is by that river, with the ferryman Vasudeva, that he finally arrives at something. Not through teaching, not through doctrine, through listening. To the river, to the water, to the voice that said when everything else had gone quiet. He finds Kamala again, his old teacher in love, dying from a snakebite near the river, and her son, his son, it turns out, who is angry and difficult and refuses to be comforted. And Siddhartha recognizes, in the boy's stubborn unhappiness, the echo of his own. He cannot help the boy. The boy has to leave. The leaving is the way. Even this, even the love for a child, cannot be made into a handed-down path. And at the end, Govinda comes to him. Old Govinda, who went with the Buddha all those years ago and stayed, who followed the teaching faithfully, who is still kind and still trying. He asks Siddhartha what he has found. And Siddhartha says something that resists summary, but if you had to name the center of it, it might be this: the world is complete. Every moment is complete. There is nothing missing and nothing to be added, and the search for the teaching is itself what prevented him from seeing that for so long. Govinda bends to kiss Siddhartha's forehead, and in that moment he sees 1,000 faces, all of them flowing, all of them completing and replacing each other in the same steady current. And the thing he sees is not nothing, it is everything. That is the book. Now here is the stall. Hesse wrote the first part of Siddhartha, the Brahmin's son, the Sermones, the encounter with the Buddha, relatively quickly, in 1919. And then he stopped. He could not write the second part. The part where Siddhartha goes into the world, takes Kamala as his teacher, becomes a merchant, loses himself. He tried. He put the pages down. He walked in the chestnut trees. He painted. He waited. More than a year passed. Perhaps closer to 2. Some have read this stall as bound up with precisely the difficulty of what the second part required Hesse to do. Because the first part of Siddhartha is about renunciation, about a young man turning away from the comfortable life, the home, the father, the received tradition. And Hesse had done that. He knew that arc from the inside. But the second part required him to write a man entering fully into the world, into the body, into desire and pleasure and the grinding, ordinary accumulation of a life lived for its own sake, and then losing himself there. And Hesse, who had spent years doing the inward work, who had been in analysis and come through a crisis that had turned his face almost entirely toward the interior, he had to find his way back into the world in order to write the man who finds his way into the world. He had to know, not just theorize, what it felt like to be lost in exactly that way. The visit to Jung may have been part of what moved something, not because Jung told him what to write, but because Jung was himself a man who had gone down into his own interior, as far down as the Red Book, as far down as those years of deliberate self-confrontation, and come back, who had found that the descent was not the final destination, but the preparation for something that came after, who embodied, in his person, the possibility that a man could go very deep into himself and return with something that could be used. This is speculative. Hesse did not write a letter saying, "The visit to Znacht freed me to write the second part of Siddhartha." The connection between the renewed contact and the end of the stall is a reading, not a documented fact, and it should be held as a reading. But it sits in the right place in the chronology, and it rhymes with the book's own argument, and that is enough to hold it gently, like a possibility rather than a proof. Because what Siddhartha is finally about, what the whole arc of the book comes to, is this: wholeness cannot be taught. It can only be lived. Every teacher in the book is eventually outgrown. The Sermones, who taught austerity. The Buddha himself, the greatest teacher of the tradition, who is met and thanked and turned away from. Kamala, who taught love and the body. Vasudeva, the ferryman who teaches through silence and the sound of the river, and even Vasudeva eventually dissolves into the water. His teaching completed, his presence no longer necessary. Even the best teacher is, in the end, a door that opens and must be walked through. The walking through is the thing. The door is not. This maps onto individuation in a way that is too precise to be accidental. In Jung's thinking, the thinking that had been circulating through Lang's sessions, that Hesse had absorbed in all his selective writer's way, the self is not something that can be given to you. It is not a doctrine you can receive from the outside, no matter how true the doctrine is or how wise the teacher. The self is what you become. Through the whole effort and error and loss and recognition of your specific, unrepeatable life. The path is not available for borrowing. You cannot take someone else's completed individuation and carry it home and install it in your own house. Hesse understood this in a way that felt, to him, urgent and personal. He had sat with Lang for those many months and received something real. He had gone to Gnostic and sat with Jung and received something else, also real. But the receiving was not the arrival. The receiving was only the opening. He still had to do the thing himself, write it himself, live it himself, find, in his own experience of getting lost, in the world, in the body, in the merchant's comfortable pleasures, the thing that could not be handed to him in a consulting room. Siddhartha's refusal of the Buddha's teaching is not a repudiation of the teaching, it is an enactment of the teaching's deepest claim. The Buddha found the way himself. So must you. The Buddha knows this. That is why, when Siddhartha turns away, the Buddha smiles. Not because Siddhartha is right to dismiss the Dharma, but because Siddhartha is right to insist on living it. There is something in that smile that feels like a message Hesse was writing to himself. He had the map. He had the vocabulary. He had the sessions with Lang and the letter from Jung and the essay he had written warning himself and others about the trap of seeking cure. He knew the direction, and still he had to stall for a year or more in the middle of the book, unable to write the man who goes into the world, until something in him, perhaps the visit, perhaps the time, perhaps simply the patient accumulation of days in Montagnola, found its way to the other side. The second part came. The merchant Siddhartha, the gambler, the man who wakes one morning and does not recognize himself in the mirror of the life he has made. The river, Vasudeva, Kamala arriving with the child, the snake bite, the death, the boy who refuses to be consoled and runs away, and the father who has to let him go, and the ferryman at the end of his teaching walking into the water. And Siddhartha, on the bank, listening, the river says Om. It says all things at once. It says nothing separately and everything together. It does not advise. It does not analyze. It flows. Hesse finished the book. He sent it into the world in 1922, 3 years after the move to Montagnola, roughly a year after the visit to Gnostic. He was 44 years old. And the book found its readers. Slowly at first, then steadily. Then, much later, in ways he did not anticipate and might have found both flattering and faintly alarming, enormously the book found an entirely different generation of readers in a different country, in a different century, who carried it in their pockets as though it were a kind of portable river. But that is already the far future. Stay with him now, in 1922, in the stone house in Montagnola, the chestnut trees outside, the book finished. The man who had refused to be cured now, looking at what the refusal had made. There is a phrase he used in the essay about artists and psychoanalysis that stays with me. He did not want, he wrote, to be adjusted to bourgeois normality. He did not want the analysis to resolve him into a comfortable, well-functioning version of what society expected a man to be. The wound, the restlessness, the difficulty of being the particular person he was, These were not aberrations to be smoothed. They were the source. Treat them away, and you might have a quieter life. You would not have Siddhartha, and you would not, a few years later, have Steppenwolf. But that is where we are going in a moment. First, there is one more thing to say about the visit to Znacht and what Hesse carried away from it. He was impressed by Jung. He said so. The force of personality, the quality of attention, the ability to sit with contradiction without flinching. And he carried something from that visit, some confirmation, perhaps, of what he had already sensed through Lang, that the framework was real and could do real work. But he walked away. He walked back to Montagnola. He did not return to the consulting room in Znacht for more sessions after that shorter stretch was done. He did not become a Jungian the way some people become Jungians, with the system adopted wholesale, the vocabulary arriving in conversation where ordinary words used to be, the collected works on the shelf marked at every third page. He remained, as he remained about most things, half in and half out, taking what he could use, declining the rest. Not out of ingratitude. Out of the same precision that made him refuse the Fontane Prize, he could not accept something that was not, strictly speaking, he could not accept a complete system that was not, strictly speaking, earned. The earning had to be his own. Jung understood this. At some level he must have understood it, because he did not press. The correspondence continued, warm, intermittent. The kind of correspondence between people who recognize each other's thinking without needing to be in constant contact. The recognition was mutual and real. The distance was also mutual and real. Two men, on the same lake, in the same country, in the same strange years. Both of them looking at the same question from different angles. How does a person become whole? How does the divided self arrive at the self? One of them building a tower by a lake and filling a red book with images he did not fully understand yet. The other one painting watercolours in Montagnola and refusing, politely and precisely and with genuine gratitude, to let someone else's answer stand in for the one he still had to find himself. The chestnut trees outside the window, the afternoon light, the brush loaded with colour, the paper waiting. The river, somewhere in the distance, saying 10 years passed. The river kept saying what rivers say. Hesse had moved to Montagnola in the Italian-speaking canton of Ticino in 1919. A small stone house on a hillside. Vineyards below, the Lake of Lugano shining in the distance, the kind of Mediterranean light that feels borrowed from a different, older world. He painted watercolours there. He tended a garden. He wrote letters that ran for pages and received letters that ran for pages back. He was, by the ordinary measures, more stable than he had been in 1916. The worst of the collapse had passed. The father had been buried. Mia was in care. Martin had recovered. The war was over. And yet, there is a particular kind of person for whom stability is never quite the whole story. For whom the quiet life and the painted vineyards sit on top of something that has not fully resolved and probably never will, because the unresolved thing is not an illness, but a question, and questions do not get better. They only get more clearly stated. Hesse was this kind of person. He knew he was this kind of person. He had made, by 1927, a kind of peace with being this kind of person, and then he wrote a book about it. Der Steppenwolf, The Steppenwolf, published in 1927 when Hesse was 50 years old. The title refers to a wolf of the steppes, a creature of the open wild, Set down in the middle of a middle-class apartment block, in a middle-class German city, surrounded by bourgeois furniture and middle-class expectations, and all the careful smallness of a world that has decided comfort is the same thing as life. Harry Haller is the man who feels like that wolf. Educated, musical, cultured, 50 years old, capable of genuine tenderness and equally capable of genuine contempt. He rents a room from a respectable widow who appreciates his quietness. He has books. He has a gramophone. He has his despair, which he carries as carefully as a man carries a glass that is already cracked, aware that any sudden movement will finish it. The book is strange in its structure. Most novels arrive as novels. Steppenwolf arrives as a document, a preface by a young bourgeois nephew who has found the manuscript of a middle-aged man named Harry Haller. Then the manuscript itself, and then, nested inside the manuscript, a small printed pamphlet that Harry finds pressed into his hand by a stranger one night on a dark street. The pamphlet is called the Traktat vom Steppenwolf, the Treatise on the Steppenwolf. It is addressed, with a dry courtesy that could almost be mistaken for warmth, to Harry Haller himself. And what it tells him, in its cool, diagnostic way, is this: you are wrong about yourself. Not wrong to feel out of place, not wrong to suffer, but wrong in your diagnosis of your own suffering. You believe yourself to be two beings divided against each other, the man and the wolf, the cultivated intellectual and the raw animal. Civilization and instinct fighting it out inside one unhappy body. You have taken this twonus as your essential nature, as the explanation of everything, as the sentence under which you live. And the treatise, with the patience of something that has been waiting a long time, says, no, that is not it. You are not two. You are 1,000. Let us sit with that for a moment. The self is not a duality. The familiar story we tell about our own inner conflict, the good self and the bad self, the disciplined self and the wild self, the self I show the world and the self I hide from it. That story, however honestly meant, is still a simplification, a way of organizing the chaos by reducing it to two teams. It is tidier than the truth. The truth, as the treatise states it to Harry Haller, is that there is no clean line running down the middle of a person. There are not two selves, there are hundreds. A bundle of souls, a sheaf of them, each with its own history, its own fear, its own desire, its own relationship to the morning light and to the night. The wolf and the man are just the two that happen to be loudest today. Now, if you have spent any time in the world of Jungian psychology, you will have heard something close to this. You will have heard that the self is not a simple unity, that the ego is only the brightest light in a much larger room. That behind it are other figures, the shadow, the anima, the complexes, the archetypes, each of them alive in a way, each of them capable of taking over the voice for a while, each of them with something to say. What Hesse put in the treatise, the idea that a person is not one being and not two beings, but an enormous multiplicity that has been, for the sake of social convenience. Compressed into a single named body, this is the Jungian notion of the self made into fiction, made visceral, made readable, made into a small cold pamphlet that a wolfman finds on a dark street at midnight. But notice what Hesse does with it. He does not let Harry read the treatise and feel better. He does not let the idea function as a solution. Harry reads it and feels seen, which is not the same thing as feeling better, and may in fact be considerably worse in the short term, because being seen clearly, when you have spent a long time being obscure even to yourself, is a kind of vertigo. The ground was supposed to be there. Now you are told the ground is made of 1,000 small moving things. Thank you very much. The novel does not stay in the apartment with the gramophone. It descends. Harry Haller descends through the city at night, through cheap cafes and dance halls, through his encounter with a young woman named Hermione, who takes him in hand with an authority that does not announce itself as authority, but simply is. She teaches him to dance. She introduces him to a saxophone player named Pablo, who is serene in the way that completely embodied people are serene, not because they have achieved something, but because they have never needed to. And then, at the end, there is the magic theatre. The magic theatre. Entrance only for madmen. Not for everyone. It is a corridor of doors. Each door opens onto a different self, a different possibility, a different story Harry Haller might be living, or has already lived, or has refused to live. The magic theatre is not a metaphor for insanity. It is closer to a metaphor for completeness. Behind the doors are all the selves that have been compressed away, all the wolves that were told to sit down, all the 1,000 souls folded into one name that rents a room from a respectable widow and owns a gramophone and suffers very quietly and very well. The theatre asks Harry to claim them, not to perform them all at once, which would be chaos, but to know them, to stop pretending the corridor has only one door. At the end of the theatre, Harry does something terrible by the ordinary moral measure. He is shown a judgment, and he refuses to run from it, and the teacher, if you can call Pablo that, tells him he must learn to laugh. The immortals laugh, he says. They have that in them. Humour that is not cruelty, not dismissal, not the defence mechanism of the man who has given up feeling, but something lighter and braver, the laughter of a person who has looked at the full absurdity of being 1,000 selves packed into one body on one spinning rock and found it, in the end, more comic than tragic. Not because it does not hurt, but because the hurt and the wonder live in the same house. This is the integration that depth psychology calls individuation. Not the resolution of conflict into peace, not the wolf tamed into the man's living room. The knowledge that both are you, and the 1,000 others behind them are also you. And the self that holds all of them is larger and stranger and more capable of laughter than any single voice in the corridor knew. Hesse knew the theory. He had been sitting with it since 1916, since the sanatorium near Lucerne, since those sessions with the Gnostic-minded doctor who taught him to listen to the figures rising up in his own depths. He had read the essays. He had spoken with Jung himself. But Steppenwolf is not a diagram of the theory. It is the theory broken open, set walking, made to sweat and dance and commit a small terrible act and then be asked to laugh. Theory is a map. The novel is the territory. And there is Hermione. Let us talk about Hermione for a moment, because Hermione is one of the most quietly astonishing things Hesse ever did. She arrives as a stranger. Harry meets her in a dance hall, exhausted and a little lost. And she takes charge in the way that only people who genuinely see you can take charge, not by demanding anything, but by simply knowing. She knows what he needs. She knows the shape of his loneliness without being told. She mirrors him, as he says himself. She is like the reflection of his own self in a mirror. And then, gradually, she tells him her name. Hermann. In German, Hermann is the feminine form of Hermann. Hesse's own name was Hermann Hesse. The name is not hidden, it is sitting right there on the page, in plain sight, dressed up as coincidence for anyone who needs it to be coincidence, and available as confession for anyone who does not. Hermann is Harry's anima. The word anima in Jung means, most simply, the inner feminine of a man, the part of him that carries the qualities he has assigned to the female, the tenderness and the intuition and the willingness to be fully present to feeling rather than managed away from it. Every man in Jung's reading of the psyche carries such a figure, and she tends to show up in the people he falls for. The women he can't forget, the relationships that feel like recognition rather than acquaintance. She also shows up, sometimes, in fiction. When a novelist names his protagonist's most essential guide after his own feminine self, and makes her his mirror, and lets her teach him to dance, and then, in the final devastating move of the magic theatre, has him destroy her, or the image of her, and be judged for it, and refuse to look away, well, it is hard not to feel that something real is happening in the story, something that went beyond craft. Hermine is not the first of these figures in Hesse's fiction. She has sisters. Frau Eva in Demian, the mother of Max Demian, the boy who leads Sinclair through the underworld of his own adolescence. Frau Eva is enormous in the novel, not large in the physical sense, but large in the way that certain presences are large, the way that things feel large when you are young and still learning the borders of the world. She is warm and she knows things, and she is not surprised by anything Sinclair is or wants or fears. She is the great mother, in Jung's vocabulary, the anima in her most ancient, most welcoming form. She calls Sinclair to herself in the dream sequence that runs through the book like a river running under the plot, and when he finally meets her in the waking world, she is exactly as she was in the dream. The real and the imagined folded into the same woman. And then Kamala in Siddhartha, the courtesan in the city below the mango grove, who teaches the young Brahmin's son everything he does not know about the body and about being fully alive to the senses. She is not a romantic figure in the easy sense. She is a teacher. She takes Siddhartha seriously, which is its own form of love. She holds her own life with a completeness that Siddhartha, for all his spiritual training, has not yet managed to hold his. She gives him a son he will not know for years. And then she dies, in the novel's final movement, having been bitten by a snake, and she dies at the river, and Siddhartha tends her, and the river keeps moving. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. In every major novel, there is a woman who functions as guide and mirror and call back to wholeness. She is not a love interest in the conventional sense, though there is love in the relationship. She is the figure that the divided protagonist does not fully understand himself to be incomplete without, until she appears. Frau Eva, Kamala, Hermine, each of them carrying something back to the protagonist that he had put down, or never knew he had, or lost in the compression of a self that had tried to manage itself into one thing. Jung called the anima the soul image, the inner woman in a man who shows him back to himself, who holds the feeling and the depth and the willingness to remain in contact with what hurts. When she is projected outward, when you encounter her wearing the face of a real person, the result can be the most disorienting experience a person has. You feel as if you have met someone you already know. You feel as if something has been returned to you. You cannot explain it, and you cannot quite recover from it, and you do not, if you are honest, entirely want to. Hesse did not need to have read that passage in a psychology textbook to have lived it. He had lived it. He put it in the books. And then there is the other story, the quieter one, that runs alongside the novels and the meetings with Jung and the painted watercolours in Montagnola. The story of Dr. Josef Bernhard Lang. Lang did not disappear after 1917. That is the thing about the people who see you through a crisis. They do not simply fold back into the distance when the crisis passes. Lang and Hesse remained in contact. They wrote to each other. They visited. The Gnostic-minded doctor and the novelist continued the conversation that had begun in those 70-odd sessions in the sanatorium near Lucerne, continued it for years. The way conversations between people who have genuinely thought together tend to continue long after the official occasion for them has passed. But Lang was not well. He had been, from the beginning, an unusual man. Steeped in astrology and ancient languages and Gnostic texts that most of his contemporaries would have waved away as eccentricity. More scholar-mystic than clinician. More fellow-traveller than doctor when it came to Hesse. But he had also been, when Hesse first walked into the sanatorium in 1916, the steadier of the two. The one with the chair on the other side of the room. The one who listened. Over the years, something shifted in that balance. Lang struggled. With what, exactly, the record does not make perfectly clear. The biographies speak with some care around the details of a man who is not the main subject of their books. But the picture that emerges, slowly through Hesse's letters and through what is documented of the relationship, is of a man who had carried others through their darkness and found, when he looked up, that his own darkness had been accumulating quietly in the meantime. The healer who needed healing. The analyst who leaned, increasingly, on the patience and steadiness of the patient he had once helped. Hesse bore it. That is perhaps the simplest and most honest thing you can say. He bore it with the same precision and the same refusal of easy sentiment that characterized everything else he did. He did not abandon Lang. He did not romanticize the reversal. Either he wrote about it in some of his letters, not with drama, but with that quiet Hessian acknowledgement that things are rarely what they started out being, that the people who help us and the people we help are sometimes, given enough time, the same people, and that this is not a tragedy, but simply the shape of things. It is, in its way, another version of the question both he and Jung had been circling all along. The divided self. The self that is not one thing but many, not one role but a shifting repertoire of capacities, some present in one season and depleted in another. Lang had been the stable one. Then he wasn't. Hesse had been the patient. Then he wasn't, quite. The categories held for a while, and then the life happened, and the categories became approximate. Pistorius, in Demian, the organist heretic who teaches Sinclair about Abraxas and about the voices rising from the depths of the self, Pistorius is outgrown. That is the novel's unsentimental move. Sinclair loves him and learns from him, and then, in a passage of painful honesty, tells him that what he teaches is archaeology, is old material, is a looking backward rather than a going forward. And Pistorius receives this, wounded and dignified, and lets Sinclair leave. He is portrayed by his own patient, in fiction, as a man whose greatness is also a limitation, as a man who can see the country but cannot himself enter it. Whether Lang ever read Demian and recognized himself, we do not know for certain. The biographies do not tell us what that conversation looked like, or if it was had at all. But Hesse knew. He had named him, barely disguised, in the most personally revealing book he ever wrote. He had given his doctor the dignity of a fully realized character and the honesty of a fully human limitation. It was, in its strange way, a form of gratitude. It was also, in its strange way, a form of the truth he had always insisted on. Now, there is a book published in 1965 called C.G. Jung and Hermann Hesse, A Record of Two Friendships. It was written by a Chilean man named Miguel Serrano, who had known both men in the last years of their lives. He describes visits and conversations and intimate moments, Jung at Znacht, Hesse in Montagnola, two great men speaking in the late afternoon light about the things that matter. The scenes have a warmth to them, a quality of witnessed intimacy. They have been quoted widely. They have shaped the popular picture of Hesse and Jung as two old friends who sat together and compared the contents of their extraordinary minds over tea or wine, or whatever one drinks in Switzerland when one is a famous old thinker. It is worth knowing that Miguel Serrano, in the decades after this book was published, moved into ideological territory so dark that his testimony about anything must be weighed with considerable care. He became in time an adherent of an esoteric form of far-right politics so extreme that it is genuinely difficult to know where the mysticism ends and the hatred begins. He was not this, or not openly this, when he sat with Jung and Hesse. But he was, always, a man with an agenda, a man who wanted the two figures he admired to be a particular kind of thing, and who may have shaped his recollections accordingly. The intimate scenes he reports are not corroborated by other sources. The feelings he assigns to both men in those scenes are feelings he could not have witnessed, but must have inferred, or imagined, or wanted. This does not mean nothing he wrote was true. It means it should be held lightly and at arm's length and never load-bearing. The relationship between Hesse and Jung is real and documented and complex enough on its own terms, in the letters, in the essays, in the novels themselves, that it does not need the romantic overlay of a man with his own mythology to construct. The story is strange and rich enough without the embroidery. Set Serrano aside then, gently, without drama. Return to what can be verified. What can be verified is this. A novelist in a Swiss sanatorium in 1916, in the wreckage of a year that had taken almost everything from him, being met by a strange and learned man who said, "The things rising up in you are not symptoms, they are figures. They are worth listening to." What can be verified is that the novelist listened over 70-odd sessions and many years of letters and friendship, and that what he heard found its way into 3 novels that have been read continuously for 100 years. What can be verified is that the psychiatrist and the novelist circled the same questions from different chairs, arrived at some of the same images, the same buried God, the same strange word Abraxas almost simultaneously, and recognized in each other a kinship of inquiry without becoming each other. What can be verified is that the novelist received a Nobel Prize in 1946. The prize awarded for the whole of his life's work, Demian and Siddhartha and Steppenwolf, and, as the crown of it, The Glass Bead Game, that last great novel of a man named Joseph Knecht in a future civilization devoted entirely to the life of the mind, playing a game of infinite complexity with the world's accumulated knowledge, and then choosing to leave the game. Choosing to come down from the mountain of pure intellect into the ordinary human world, into a particular lake, in the company of a particular child, and dying there, swimming, in the cold water, his death a kind of gift. The Glass Bead Game is not an obviously psychological novel in the way that Steppenwolf is. It is more architectural, more philosophical, more concerned with the question of how a civilization manages its wisdom and what gets lost when wisdom becomes a performance of wisdom. But it carries, like all Hesse's later work, the watermark of the question that was stamped into the paper in 1916. What is a self? What is wholeness? How does a person spend a life without spending it entirely on the wrong thing? Joseph Knecht. The name means servant. He is a man of extraordinary gifts who rises to the highest position in his world, master of the glass bead game, and then looks at the position and the honour and the beautiful, self-enclosed perfection of the life it represents, and decides to leave it. Not because it is bad, because it is not enough, because the complete and the merely perfect are different things, and he can feel the difference, and he cannot unknow it. He goes down. He goes down into life, into service of a different kind, into the cold lake, into death. And what Hesse seems to be saying at the end of a long life and a long body of work is something like this: the self is not protected by retreating into the beautiful game. The self is found by going down, by risking the cold water, by staying in contact with what is real and ordinary and mortal and not already understood. The Nobel Prize Committee gave him the prize in 1946. He was 69 years old. He had spent 30 years in Montagnola by then, in the stone house on the hillside with the vineyards below. He had spent 30 years painting watercolours that he said clarified something for him. He had spent 30 years writing letters that run, in the collected edition, to thousands of pages. He had spent 30 years as, in his own dry formulation, a difficult person who had the good fortune to be allowed to be difficult. The crisis of 1916 was 30 years behind him. Joseph Lang was gone. The sanatorium at Lucerne had receded into the past. Jung was still alive, still at Snucht, still building his tower, stone by stone, the two of them in the same country. The correspondence still warm and intermittent. And the wound that had been opened in that terrible year when the father died and the wife was lost and the son was sick and the press called him a traitor, the wound had not closed. That is the most important thing to say about it. The wound had not closed, and Hesse had decided at some point he could not exactly name. That closing it was not the point. The analysis with Lang had not been about closing. Lang, to his credit, had never pretended otherwise. The Jungian project, as Hesse understood it and as he had absorbed it through those years of sessions and letters and reading, was never about making the wound disappear. It was about making the wound legible, about turning what was breaking you into something you could look at and name and carry with more knowledge of what you were carrying. The scar is part of the self. The shadow is part of the self. The 1,000 souls you have been compressing into one presentable name are all part of the self. The self, the larger thing, holds all of them, not by resolving them, by being big enough. What was hidden inside the Nobel Prize was not a borrowed doctrine. Hesse had been clear about this in the essays, in the letters, in the polite precision with which he had declined to become a Jungian. The ideas had helped him. The analysis had helped him. The strange and learned figure of Joseph Lang, with his Gnostic texts and his astrology and his willingness to take the rising figures seriously, had helped him in ways that Hesse spent the rest of his life acknowledging, quietly, in the work itself. But the wound was his. He had gone into the sanatorium carrying it, and he had come out still carrying it, better acquainted with its weight and its edges, able to walk with it in a way he had not been able to walk with it before. The novels are not case studies. They are not illustrations of a theory. They are what happens when a man of extraordinary sensitivity and craft sits down with his wound and makes it mean something, turns the private crisis into the public form. gives Emil Sinclair's bird fighting its way out of the egg to everyone who has ever felt, in the small hours of a night that would not end, that the shell they are living inside is both their only home and the thing that is slowly suffocating them. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. You have felt this. Perhaps not in those words, perhaps not with that particular Gnostic deity hovering in the background, but you have felt the thing the words are pointing at. The sense that you are living inside something that was once the right size for you and is no longer. The sense that the self you have been presenting to the world, competent, controlled, reliable, awake, is a version of you that has been selected for by circumstances and is not the whole of you. The sense that there is more. This is not a comfortable feeling. It tends to arrive at inconvenient times. At 3 in the morning, in the dark, when the day's business has gone quiet and the deeper business makes itself heard. When the gramophone is silent and the books are closed and it is just you and the question. Hesse knew. He knew at 39, and he knew at 50, and he knew at 69 when they gave him the prize, and he was grateful and also, characteristically, slightly amused by the whole affair. Because prizes are given for completed work, and the work of being a self is never completed, and the gap between those two things was not lost on him. What Lang gave him in the sanatorium by Lucerne was permission. Not permission to be broken. He was already broken, and breaking does not require a doctor's signature. Permission to take the breaking seriously. Permission to treat the figures arising from his own depths as figures worth listening to rather than symptoms worth suppressing. Permission to carry the wound into the studio rather than lie down until it went away. What Jung gave him in the correspondence and the brief analysis and the warm, mutual, careful distance of two men who respected each other too much to fully merge was a vocabulary, not a solution. A set of words for things that were already there. Shadow, anima, individuation, the self that holds the 1,000 souls. Words are not nothing. Words are how the mind makes contact with what it is experiencing. The right word, arriving at the right moment, can be the difference between chaos and navigation. Hesse took the words and used them, and then put them down when they had done their work, the way a good carpenter puts down a tool when the joint is cut. And the novels remain. They remain in a way that clinical case notes do not remain, and in a way that theoretical treatises do not quite remain either, because the novels are alive in the way that only things made from genuine necessity are alive. Demian is still being read by people who feel the shell pressing. Siddhartha is still being read by people who need to hear that you can sit by a river long enough and the river will tell you something. Steppenwolf is still being read by people who have been told they are wrong about their own two-ness, who have been told they are not 2 but 1,000 and have not decided yet whether that is terrifying or liberating. It is, in the end, both. That is the answer the novels give, if you stay with them long enough. The answer is not one thing. The self is not one thing. You are not one thing. You are the wolf, and the man, and the immortal who laughs, and the child who was afraid of Franz Kromer in the dark schoolyard, and the person lying here now in the quiet, breathing slowly, letting the day's tight grip loosen by degrees. You are all of it. And the thing that holds all of it, the thing that does not need to choose between them, the thing that is large enough, is already in you, has always been in you, was there before the crisis and will be there after the sleep. The analysis does not install it. The novel does not install it. The river does not install it. They only point. And the point is not a place you arrive at, it is the direction you keep moving in. Hesse moved in that direction for 85 years. He was born in 1877 in the Black Forest, the son of missionaries who gave him a serious God and a serious conscience and a seriousness about the interior life that he could neither shed nor fully inhabit in the form they had given it. He remade it, over and over, through the early novels that poured out easily and the crisis that stopped everything and the Lucerne sanatorium and the watercolours and Montagnola and Demian and the pseudonym and the prize returned and Siddhartha and the stalled year by the river and Steppenwolf and the magic theatre and the Nobel and the glass bead game and Joseph Necht walking down to the lake and the cold water receiving him. He died in 1962, quietly, in his sleep, in the stone house in Montagnola. He was 85 years old. The vineyards were outside. The lake of Lugano was shining below. The chestnut trees were presumably doing what chestnut trees do in August in the Italian-speaking canton, which is to say they were there, full of green life, indifferent to prizes and to theories of the self, patient in the way that old things are patient. Lang had died years before him in 1945, having lived his difficult and bookish and somewhat haunted life to its end. Jung would die in 1961, a year before Hesse, having built his tower and filled his red book and elaborated his psychology into a body of work that would outlast him and perplex and inspire people in roughly equal measure, and having remained to the last. The kind of man who took the figures in the dark seriously because he had met them personally and found them worth the attention. Two men, on the same lake, in the same country, in the same strange century. The question they shared, how does a divided person become whole, is still open. It does not close. It is not the kind of question that closes. It is the kind of question that becomes clearer and richer and more honestly stated as the years go by, and that is perhaps the best thing a question can do. And you, lying here, in whatever room this is, at whatever hour this finds you, you carry a version of it too. You do not need to call it by any of these names. You do not need the Gnostic god Abraxas, or the anima, or the treatise on the Steppenwolf, or the river saying Om. You only need to notice, if you have felt it tonight, that you are more than one thing. That the self you carry into the day is not the whole of you. That somewhere beneath it, patient and quiet, and not particularly in a hurry, there is a larger room. You do not need to enter it tonight. You only need to know it is there. The bird in the egg does not fight its way out all at once. It rests. It gathers itself. It waits for the moment when the pressure from inside and the thinning of the shell are exactly equal, and then, when the time is right, it pushes. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for letting the day's hard work of being a person settle into something quieter. Let Hesse have his garden in Montagnola, his colours, his afternoon light. Let Lang have his strangeness and his books and his astrology and the genuine, difficult grace with which he met a broken man in 1916 and said, "These are figures, they are worth listening to." Let Jung have his tower and his red book and his careful, brilliant, difficult attempt to map the country that none of us can stop living in. Let the wound be what it is. Let it be the thing that made Demian possible, and Siddhartha and Steppenwolf, and the long patient life of a man who refused to be cured and became instead something closer to whole. Let the river say what it says. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.